She was just a waitress, until she exposed a billion-dollar legal flaw that top lawyers missed. What followed was a storm of sabotage, courtroom tension, and a fight to build a legacy from scratch. But she didn't just rewrite a contract, she rewrote the rules. This isn't just a story about law. It's about power, purpose, and rising when the world says sit down. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe. More true, powerful stories are waiting for you. They say you never forget the day your life changes. But for me, it started like any other Monday night. Grimy counters, the scent of overcooked bacon clinging to my apron, and the familiar buzz of the neon open sign bleeding into the windows of Rusty's Diner. I was 22, barely scraping by on tips and diner grease, and the only thing I translated most days was customers' moods. Tired, bitter, lonely, hungover, rinse, repeat. Then he walked in. Not the kind of man who belonged there. Not the kind who ordered from laminated menus or sat on cracked vinyl stools. No. This one wore a storm-colored suit that looked like it cost more than my rent and shoes too clean for these floors. Colin Mercer. I didn't know his name then. Just that he moved with a sharpness that didn't fit the slow rhythm of this place. He slid into a corner booth like he was trying to disappear, dropped a thick folder of papers on the table, and ordered black coffee without looking at me. His voice was low, rough around the edges, like he hadn't slept in days. "And keep it coming," he added. So I did. 30 minutes passed. He didn't touch the coffee, just sat there, hunched over the papers, scribbling in the margins with a red pen like he was fighting a war no one else could see. I brought him water. He didn't notice. I refilled the coffee. Still nothing. Then, without thinking, I said it. "Looks like you're wrestling with a bear." He glanced up, annoyed. "It's a contract," he said flatly. "You wouldn't understand." Now, I've heard a lot worse from customers, but something about the way he said it, so dismissive, so automatic, hit a nerve I thought had scarred over. "Maybe I would," I said quietly. He blinked. Then, in one sharp motion, he slapped the folder closed and pushed it toward me like it was a challenge. "If you're so damn smart," he sneered, "then translate it." The clatter of forks froze. The jukebox in the corner, halfway through a Temptations track, suddenly sounded miles away. I looked at the folder. Thick, legal, aggressive. The title page read, Hearth Mercer Merger Agreement. I should have walked away, said nothing. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up the top page and flipped. My fingers moved on instinct, muscle memory from another life. Before the medical bills. Before I left Emory's pre-law program to take care of Mom. Before I swapped textbooks for ticket books, I still read contracts for fun, leases, insurance documents, even a few corporate filings I found online. Not because I had to, because no one in my family ever had that kind of power, and I wanted to know what power looked like on paper. So I scanned. Fast. And then I stopped. "You've got a clause here," I said, pointing. Section 8B, conditional termination on market disruption. It lets the other company walk away if your stock drops more than 7% after the deal goes public. Colin stared at me like I'd spoken ancient Greek. "That's not wrong," he muttered. "Also," I added, flipping again, "the escrow terms. $400 million locked in with no clear trigger for release? That's not a partnership. That's them holding a gun to your head." Silence. Even the cook, Donnie, peeked out from behind the kitchen window. Colin leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "How do you know this?" "I used to study it," I said. "Pre-law, Emory, before my mom got sick." I shrugged. "Now I flip pancakes." He didn't speak right away, just stared at me, this mixture of suspicion and something else. "Your name?" "Tessa," I said. "Tessa Jordan." He nodded slowly like he was filing it away. "You ever think about doing more with all that sharp thinking?" I gave a half smile. I did. Life had other plans. I handed the folder back to him. "You should fix Section 8B and put a release condition on the escrow, phased based on deliverables. Otherwise, they'll squeeze you the second you look weak." Colin didn't say thank you, didn't offer an apology, just looked down at the notes I'd scribbled on the corner of the napkin and murmured, almost to himself, "Jesus." I turned to walk away. His untouched coffee still sat there, steam long gone. "Can I buy you one?" he called out. "Another cup, I mean." I looked over my shoulder. "You already did." Back in the kitchen, I leaned against the wall, heart hammering, hands still shaking. Not from fear. From the adrenaline of finally being seen, for 5 damn minutes, for something other than what I was wearing or what I served. Later that night, just before closing, I found the napkin still on the table, next to an empty mug and a generous tip. It had my own handwriting across it. This isn't advice, it's translation, and everyone deserves to understand what they're signing. I didn't know it yet, but the most important negotiation of my life had already begun, right there under a flickering neon sign, over a cold cup of coffee and a warm refusal to be underestimated. 2 nights later, the bell above the diner door jingled again, and there he was. Same tailored suit, same jaw clenched like he'd chewed glass for breakfast. But this time, Colin Mercer didn't march straight to the corner booth. He hesitated, eyes sweeping the place like he wasn't sure he belonged here anymore. His shoulders stiffened when he saw me, like he'd already played out this conversation in his head a dozen different ways and still hadn't landed on the right one. I was refilling sugar canisters when he walked up to the counter, and I didn't say anything. Just kept doing my job. "You still serving eggs at night?" he asked. "Depends," I said without looking up. "You back for the eggs?" He exhaled through his nose, then tapped the counter gently. "Back for you." I paused, not out of flattery, out of surprise that he said it out loud. "I'm working," I said evenly. He nodded. "I won't take long." There was something different about him. His voice wasn't slick this time, not sharp. Almost. Careful. He slid onto the stool like someone trying to lower himself onto uncertain ground. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. "You saved me from a potential disaster. Millions, probably more." "Must be hard," I said, wiping the counter. "Thanking a waitress." "That's the thing," he said. "I'm not sure you are just a waitress." I raised an eyebrow. "No? You see systems. You see language. You think like someone who's already had 10 years in a courtroom." He paused. "Given the chance, you'd outthink half my firm." "Only half?" I asked dryly. He smiled. "Just barely." "So what is this?" I asked, finally facing him. "A job offer?" "Not exactly," he said. "I'm offering you a conversation, off the clock. No suits, no condescension, just coffee. My treat this time." I watched him for a long second. "Come back at 10. That's when my shift ends. If you're serious, you'll wait." "I'm serious." "Then I guess we'll see." At exactly 10 p.m., I peeled off my apron, tucked it under my arm, and walked out from the back kitchen. He was still there, sitting in the same booth as last time, no coffee in front of him, just 2 mugs waiting. I slid in across from him, hair down, sweatshirt zipped up, not trying to impress, just showing up like I always had. "You're persistent," I said. "I'm curious." "About what?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me like he was trying to unravel something knotted in his chest. "How someone like you ends up here," he finally said. "Not in a courtroom, not on Capitol Hill. Here, behind a counter." I took a breath, stared out the window for a beat, then turned back to him. I had a plan, pre-law at Emory, full ride, mock trial champ. I was going to graduate top of my class. What happened? My mom's kidneys failed, dialysis 3 times a week, Medicaid barely covered it, my little brother started getting into fights at school, bills stacked up like bricks. I shrugged. School had to wait. He didn't interrupt, he just listened, really listened. No pity, no interruption, just that intense stillness I'd started to realize meant he was processing. "I kept studying," I went on. "Law journals, legal blogs, even started coding a little. I'm building this simple app, something for teens, teaches them how to read contracts, what to do if they get pulled over. Basic rights stuff." His eyes widened slightly. "You're doing all that while working night shifts at a diner? And helping mom, and tutoring my brother?" "Yeah." He leaned back like he'd just been hit with a gust of cold wind. "Who's going to take a waitress with a half-finished degree seriously?" I asked, not bitter, just blunt. "I would," he said without hesitation. I raised an eyebrow. "You? The guy who called me sweetheart and told me to stick to pouring coffee?" His jaw tightened. "I deserved that." "Yeah," I said simply. "But I'm not stupid," he said. "I've built a career out of spotting talent before anyone else knows it's there. And what I saw the other night, Tessa, that wasn't casual intelligence. That was insight. That was rare." I looked down, fingers tracing the edge of the mug. The weight of what he said settled somewhere I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. "I'm not asking for charity," I said. "Good. I'm not offering it." He leaned in, his voice quieter. "I want to help you build that app. Developers, resources, legal vetting, funding. You lead. I back you." It should have floored me, but instead, I just sat there, arms crossed, letting it land like a steady heartbeat. "I don't want to be your project," I said. "I want to be your equal." "You will be," he promised. Outside, the world kept buzzing, trucks downshifting, the hum of late-night power lines. But in that booth, something sparked. Not a pitch, not a proposal, something quieter. A shift, a seed. I didn't answer right away. I just nodded once. "I guess we'll see," I said, and finished the last sip of my coffee. He smiled, but it was faint, almost hopeful. That night, I walked home under the buzz of streetlights and the scent of overripe magnolia. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was stuck. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was on the edge of something that could finally break wide open. The first time I stepped into Mercer Tech headquarters, I felt like an imposter in a cathedral of glass. Everything was too clean, too quiet. The floors gleamed like still water, and the elevators whispered open and shut with robotic precision. Even the air smelled engineered, like air conditioning and ambition. I wore the best thing I owned, a navy blouse I'd scored at Goodwill, black jeans that still had a stubborn grease stain on the hem, and sneakers I'd scrubbed until the soles looked nearly new. My hair was pulled back into a low bun, and my only bag was a thrifted leather binder full of notes, sketches, and the outline of my app, LawCorp. That binder might as well have been armor. The receptionist barely glanced up when I walked in. She asked for my name twice, then hesitated before letting me through. Like my existence didn't line up with her expectations. When I got to the 29th floor, Colin was already waiting outside the boardroom. He smiled, a real one this time, a little sheepish. "You made it. Were you expecting I wouldn't?" "No," he said, "but I know how these places feel when they weren't built with you in mind." I appreciated that. The honesty. I nodded once, then followed him into the room. It wasn't a boardroom, not technically. More like a war room with whiteboards, flat screens, a conference table long enough to land a helicopter on, and 4 men in tailored suits seated like statues at the far end. And then there was him, Graham Delaney, head of legal, eyes sharp and mouth tight like he'd just bit into a lemon. He stood when we entered but didn't offer his hand. "Graham, this is Tessa Jordan," Colin said. "She'll be spearheading the LawCorp project." Graham raised one eyebrow. "The Waitress." I smiled politely. "Still do weekends. The tips are better than you think." He didn't laugh, just took a seat again with the grace of someone who never expected to be challenged. Colin gestured for me to begin. I walked to the nearest screen and connected my old laptop. The cord sparked slightly. No one flinched, but I could feel the judgment thick in the air. I didn't care. I pulled up the demo slides I'd worked on all night and started speaking. "We're calling it LawCorp," I said, "though that's flexible. It's a digital tool for legal literacy. Not for lawyers, but for everyday people. High school students, working moms, people on probation, immigrants, anyone who's ever been handed a document they couldn't understand and told to sign anyway." The first slide showed a lease agreement. I clicked once. The app parsed it into bullet points in plain English. This is what it means. This is when it expires. This is what happens if you break it. No one spoke, not even Graham. I clicked again. Another slide showed a police stop scenario. "You're pulled over. What are your rights? What are your options? What do you not say?" This is what I want to put in their hands. Not just information, but a kind of flashlight. I kept it tight, clean. No fluff, just impact. When I finished, there was silence. Then, one of the suits, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, a gold tie clip, cleared his throat. "Interesting. But what about liability? If someone follows your app's advice and it backfires?" "It's not advice," I said. "It's education. Every scenario is based on public information. Every screen is paired with disclaimers. This isn't a replacement for legal counsel. It's a first step for people who've never had one." Graham leaned back. "Still feels risky. Scaling something like this to schools? Community centers? That's exposure." "To what?" I asked. "Helping people understand the rules they already live under?" Colin finally stepped in. "We'll vet it thoroughly. She'll work with your department on framework." Graham gave a slow, condescending nod. "Of course. We'll do what we can." The message was clear. We'll bury her in red tape until she gets tired or makes a mistake. As the room cleared, Colin lingered by the window. "He's going to stall me," I said quietly. Colin didn't disagree. "He's old school. Doesn't always see the value in In black girls with no degree? I offered. He turned to look at me. I see the value, Tessa, and I've got your back. I don't need saving, I said. I just need you to remember what you saw in me when I was behind a counter. He nodded. Deal. That night, back in my apartment, I spread out every sketch, every line of code I'd written on my busted Chromebook, every diagram I'd drawn on napkins. My little brother Elijah sat across from me doing algebra homework, music playing in his earbuds, mouthing the lyrics to some song I didn't recognize. Mom was asleep in the recliner, a heating pad buzzing faintly on her hip, the room dim except for the screen glow. The air smelled like Vicks and spaghetti. And still, I felt like I was building something in a space larger than this tiny room. I clicked through the prototype again, imagining a student using it in a dusty public school library, a single mom clicking play on her lunch break, a teenager explaining rights to his friends on a cracked iPhone. And I could already feel the resistance from people like Graham, the sideways looks, the locked doors, the invisible walls. But I'd been underestimated for years. And I'd learned to push through them. The next morning, I emailed Colin with a list of immediate priorities: accessibility features, community beta testers, interface clarity for low literacy users. He replied in under 10 minutes. Good, you move fast. Let's keep going. And I did. I didn't wait for approval. I didn't ask permission. I knew what I was building. I knew who I was building it for. But even then, I hadn't yet realized just how much some people would try to stop it. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. It started with a badge that wouldn't scan. I stood outside the glass doors of the Mercer Tech Innovation Lab, pressing my ID card against the reader like an idiot. Nothing. Not a beep, not a flicker. Just the soft, polite glow of rejection. At first, I figured it was a glitch. Systems go down, tech hiccups. But when the receptionist at the front desk looked up from her monitor with a practiced blank expression and said, "You're not in the system this week," I felt something colder move through me. "I have a standing pass," I said, keeping my voice level. "You'll need to wait for clearance," she said, tapping her screen like she hadn't just dismissed me. So I waited. An hour. By the time someone from facilities manually opened the door, the morning meeting I was supposed to lead had already started without me. Inside, I found Graham Delaney standing at the whiteboard, drawing a neat little funnel diagram titled Law Core Outreach Flow Revised Strategy. The air felt colder. He turned when I entered, gave me a smile too thin to be real. "Tessa," he said smoothly, "glad you could join us. We were just rethinking some elements of rollout strategy." I dropped my bag at the end of the table and sat, folding my hands. "What kind of rethinking?" "We're concerned about liability," he said. Some of the board members, investors, they're worried the app's language might be interpreted as legal advice. "It's not advice," I said. "It's education. It's based on publicly available statutes. Everything's paired with disclaimers." "Even so," Graham replied, his voice dipped in honey, "the company has a reputation to protect. We might want to dial back the school outreach and limit it to private beta testing for now." I glanced around the room. A few developers were watching with careful, neutral expressions. No one wanted to pick a side. "No," I said, calm but clear. "Those students are the reason this app exists. Scaling back outreach isn't about protecting the company, it's about protecting old systems." That landed like a dropped hammer. A few heads turned. One guy actually stopped typing. Graham capped his marker and stepped closer, hands clasped like a disappointed principal. "Look, Miss Jordan, we all admire your passion. But this isn't a college project. There are legal boundaries you may not fully understand." I met his gaze without flinching. "I understand boundaries just fine," I said. "I've lived inside them my whole life." He said nothing, just turned back to the board and continued like I was background noise. But from that moment, I knew what I was up against. That evening, I knocked on Colin's office door. He looked up from his screen instantly, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, tie loosened like he'd been buried in numbers for hours, but he could see it in my face before I even sat down. "They're trying to suffocate this," I said, dropping into the chair across from him. Slowly, quietly, just enough to make it seem like the app stalled on its own. He leaned back. "Who?" "Graham, and whoever's hiding behind him." Colin exhaled. "He's been with me since the beginning. He's cautious, yes, but—" "He's not cautious," I interrupted. He's afraid. Afraid of a black girl without a degree outshining his entire department. Afraid of being held accountable by someone he can't control. Colin rubbed the bridge of his nose, but he didn't argue. He looked tired, and for the first time, a little lost. "I'll handle it," he said. "No," I replied. "Let me." He looked at me. "I don't want this handed to me. I want to earn it. But when I ask for something, I need to know you'll back me." There was a long pause. Then he nodded. "You have it." The next morning, I came in early, earlier than anyone else. I brought donuts, glazed, powdered, apple fritters. I didn't say a word, just placed them on the table and started setting up my laptop. When the others trickled in, they noticed the shift. Not in food, but in me. I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I launched my presentation the moment the room filled. "I want to show you what LawCorp really is," I said. "Not from a legal risk standpoint, from a human one." I clicked play on a short video, a testimonial from a student at Langston Prep. He was tall, soft-spoken, eyes wide. He looked directly at the camera and said, "This app helped my mom understand the lease she signed. We stopped an eviction." I didn't know apps could do that. Another clip followed, a janitor who'd used the wage theft scenario to challenge his paycheck deduction. Then a single mom who avoided a payday loan trap. Each face different. Each story the same. People who had always been expected to sign without reading, to agree without understanding, now holding knowledge like armor. When the video ended, silence filled the room. Then the door opened. Graham stepped in late, arms crossed, chin high. "Tessa," he said with a practiced smile, "may I say something?" "No," I said simply. "Not until I'm done." He paused, caught off guard. I held his gaze. He said nothing. Seconds later, Colin walked in, slow, deliberate. He didn't say a word, just stood beside me at the front of the room. After a long beat, he finally spoke. "I've seen what she's building," he said, facing the team, "and I've never been more certain of anything. This company was founded on risk. If we back down now, we betray that legacy." Graham's expression didn't move, but I saw his fingers tighten around the folder he held. After the meeting, some of the developers came up to me. They shook my hand. One of them, a guy named Luis, said, "My cousin needs this app. Let me know how I can help." That night, I walked home under a sky full of buzzing street lamps and low clouds. My steps were slow, but not from doubt. I was thinking about power, not the kind printed in contracts or hidden in boardrooms. The kind built through action, through trust, through stubborn refusal to disappear. They could erase a badge, lock a door, delay a file, but they couldn't stop what had already started. I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was building something, and no one, not Graham, not the board, not an entire legacy of polished suits, was going to stop me now. It was almost midnight when I noticed it. I'd been staring at the same contract on my laptop for over 2 hours, eyes blurry, brain buzzing, fingers stained with the ink from a leaky ballpoint pen. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hiss of the radiator and Elijah snoring gently on the couch behind me. One arm draped over his algebra book like he'd fallen asleep mid-problem. Mom was in her room, tucked in with a heating pad and an old gospel station playing softly on her radio. I was surrounded by half-empty mugs, wrinkled sticky notes, and a sinking feeling that something inside the final merger agreement between Mercer Tech and Kessler Solutions just didn't sit right. I'd read the document at least 10 times already. On the surface, it looked airtight, but there was a paragraph buried in the contingency schedule, Schedule F, that made my stomach tighten every time I read it. In the event of a market-based valuation event resulting in a temporary decline exceeding 7% of pre-merger market cap, Kessler retains the right to withdraw from the agreement without penalty. At first glance, it sounded standard. Merger protections often had stock-related triggers, but that word, temporary, it kept flashing in my mind like a warning light. It hadn't been in the earlier drafts. I was sure of it. I reached over, gently pulled Elijah's earbuds from his ear. He groaned, not even opening his eyes. "Tessa, I'm not even passing English. You think I know what market-based valuation means?" I grinned, despite the pressure building in my chest. "It means if Colin's stock dips just once, just for a day, Kessler can walk away. They could tank the value with a leak, let the news cycle chew on it, then pull out of the deal and leave Mercer Tech bleeding. No penalty, no consequences." Elijah sat up, blinking slowly. "That's messed up." Yeah, I whispered. It is. By 6:45 the next morning, I was already outside the tower, shivering slightly with a coffee I hadn't touched. The city was still half asleep, and the sky was a soft steel gray. As soon as the security team unlocked the lobby doors, I bolted upstairs to the 29th floor. Colin wasn't in yet, so I went straight to the legal archives. There was a kid there, Max, an intern from Georgia State, half asleep, eating a banana and scrolling through TikTok. I flashed my badge, gave him a tight smile, and said, "I need access to all revisions of the Kessler merger agreement, draft to final." He blinked at me. Like, every version? Every single one. 30 minutes later, I had the timeline laid out in front of me. I traced the evolution of the clause through 4 drafts. Sure enough, temporary hadn't existed until 3 weeks ago. A quiet insertion slipped into the middle of a sentence that already read like corporate anesthesia. By 8 a.m., Colin stepped into his office with his phone to his ear, distracted and half awake. When he saw me already inside, standing in front of his desk, he paused. "Tessa," he said slowly, lowering the phone. I need 5 minutes." I said, "Urgent." He hung up immediately. "What's going on?" I handed him a printout, the section highlighted. Schedule F. This clause is a trap. He scanned it quickly, his brow furrowing. "I've seen this. We reviewed it with Graham's team." "They skimmed it," I interrupted. "Or worse, they missed it. Look again. That one word, temporary, gives Kessler the power to nuke this deal with a stock hit that lasts 12 hours. They walk away clean. You're left holding the wreckage." His expression shifted, confusion first, then dawning realization, and finally, something colder. A slow, simmering anger. "Why the hell would they put this in at the last minute?" he muttered. "Because they're playing you," I said. "They're waiting for the press release. They'll let the merger announcement drive up your value, then leak something to cause a dip. Hell, they don't even have to leak anything true. Just enough for a blip. They trigger this clause, pull out, and leave you exposed." Colin walked to the window, gripping the bridge of his nose. His silence was heavy. "And Graham?" I said. "He was too busy sabotaging my access to notice. Or maybe he noticed and didn't care." He turned back to me slowly. This is why you're here." I nodded once. "You saw what no one else would, but now you need to act." He didn't hesitate. He picked up his office phone and pressed a line. "Get the board. Emergency session. 10 a.m. I want legal, PR, M&A, all of them. We're rewriting this deal." At exactly 10, I sat in a high-back chair at the end of a long glass table in the executive boardroom. My seat wasn't labeled, no nameplate, but every face in that room knew who I was now. Graham entered last, his expression tight, his body tense like someone bracing for a fall. Colin stood at the head of the table and spoke without preamble. "We're pulling Clause F. Rewriting the language. Tessa Jordan identified a loophole that could have sunk this company. She brought it to me this morning. She's the reason we're still in control of this deal." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then Graham spoke. "With all due respect, we vetted that clause thoroughly." "No," Colin cut in sharp. "You glossed it, she caught what you didn't." He turned to the room. "From now on, all merger documentation passes through Tessa's desk first." A few executives exchanged glances. One woman, mid-60s, silver hair, sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Miss Jordan," she said, "how did you learn to spot something like that?" I met her gaze evenly. "I've been taught to read the fine print my whole life," I said. "Because people like me don't get second chances. We have to get it right the first time." She nodded slowly. "Good answer." After the meeting, Graham cornered me in the hallway. His smile was gone. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts," he muttered. I didn't flinch. "I don't need the spotlight," I said. "I've got the truth." He blinked, thrown off by the calm. "And unlike you," I added, stepping past him, "I don't need a title to make a difference." Later that evening, Colin found me in the lab, still bent over my laptop, polishing the next update to LawCore. He placed a folder gently in front of me. "What's this?" I asked. "Your official appointment, Director of Legal Innovation. Full salary, full benefits." I opened it slowly, stared at the letterhead, felt my throat tighten. "I thought you said I didn't need a title," I murmured. "You don't," he said. "But they do, and now they'll think twice before underestimating you again." I looked up, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. But I knew how I felt, tired, steady, and ready. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. "But we're not done yet." No, I agreed. We're just getting started. And deep down I knew this wasn't just about one clause or one deal. This was about changing who got to sit at the table and who got to flip it. The day of the Law Corps launch, I stood behind the stage curtain, gripping a folded note card I had no intention of reading. The auditorium buzzed with too many voices and too much expectation. Reporters in pressed suits, community organizers in matching t-shirts, investors in tight smiles. Cameras blinked red from every corner, like the eyes of a machine scanning for cracks. Colin had given a short welcome, sharp, clean, executive, and now the spotlight was mine. No music, no introduction. Just me, a microphone, and 500 people wondering if the waitress turned director was about to embarrass them all. I stepped out. "Good morning," I said, and the room fell into silence. "My name is Tessa Jordan. I was raised 9 blocks from here. I've waited tables, filled pill bottles for my mother, and helped my brother through school. Today, I'm standing here because I believe something simple. Understanding your rights shouldn't be a privilege. It should be a starting point." I paused, met their eyes. Law Corps isn't just an app. It's a flashlight in a locked room. The room held its breath. "This isn't about me. I don't need applause. I need you to understand what happens when people finally get the tools they were never supposed to have and use them to stand taller." I walked off stage to the sound of applause. Not polite, not reserved. Real. People clapped like they meant it. Some stood, some cried. But I didn't smile. Not yet. Because I knew what was coming next. 2 hours later, I sat in a small glass conference room just off the lobby of Mercer Tech, trying to breathe. The adrenaline had worn off, and in its place was a dull, heavy pressure in my chest. That kind of pressure only comes when you've just walked through fire and know more fire is coming. Luis, one of our UX leads, knocked on the glass and waved a tablet with wide eyes. "You need to see this," he said, nearly breathless. He turned the screen to me. On the homepage of a major tech news site, my photo filled the banner. Me at the podium, eyes lit with something between rage and purpose. The headline read, "The future of law is here, and she wears sneakers and speaks truth." Below it, a video already had 1.2 million views. Comments flooded in. "This girl is brilliant. Why hasn't the White House hired her yet?" "Another diversity stunt. Where's her degree?" "Affirmative action strikes again." I handed Luis the tablet and leaned back in my chair. "I don't care about trending," he smiled. "That's why you are." Later that night, I opened my phone and scrolled through the messages. Journalists, classmates, my high school debate coach who wrote, "Told you the fire in your chest wasn't just for show." And then, Colin. His message was simple. "Board's asking for a meeting. Today. You ready?" I stared at the screen a second before replying, "Always." When I walked into the boardroom that afternoon, the mood had shifted. There were no open laptops, no half-hearted smiles, just eyes. Watchful, assessing, calculating. Colin stood, gestured toward the head of the table. "This seat's yours today," he said. I sat, back straight, shoulders square. I wasn't performing confidence, I was confident. An older board member, Ellen Briggs, white hair, wireframe glasses, and an air of cool authority, cleared her throat. "Miss Jordan," she said, "the response has been overwhelming. The public, the press, the mayor's office, even federal interest." "I understand," I said. "But there's concern," she continued, "about leadership. The platform's reach is growing faster than expected. Some feel it might be prudent to bring in someone with more policy experience, a co-leader, to guide you." I let the silence stretch a beat too long before speaking. "I appreciate the concern," I said, "but I'll remind you, I've led every decision Law Corps has made, not out of guesswork, out of necessity. I built this because I lived the gap it's trying to close. And with all due respect, I won't be managed into silence by someone who has no skin in this fight." A younger board member leaned forward. "But with federal contracts looming, that's exactly why the person leading this can't be someone fluent in systems but disconnected from the stakes," I said. "It has to be someone who knows what it's like to sign something under pressure, without context, without power." Colin didn't speak, but I could see the pride in his expression. The silent backing of someone who'd been ready to step aside the moment I was ready to lead alone. Ellen folded her hands. "Then we'll follow your lead. But be prepared. The next few weeks won't be easy." "Success rarely is," I said. After the meeting, I walked the corridors of Mercer Tech and noticed something strange. People were smiling at me, not politely, not awkwardly, warmly, like they finally saw me not as a miracle or a disruption, but maybe, just maybe, as a leader. Back in the lab, Luis waved me over again. "You're going to want to see this," he said. The screen showed a breaking news banner. President's office reaches out to Law Corps for national pilot on legal literacy. I stared at the headline. My hands didn't move. "They want to test the app in community centers," Luis said. "Federal use, free access." The room buzzed around me, but I didn't speak. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped outside into the alley behind the building, where the cold wind could clear my head. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't touched in over a year. A woman answered. Cautious, curious. "Hello?" "Professor Harper," I said softly. "It's Tessa Jordan, remember me?" There was a pause, then a smile in her voice. "Of course I remember. I saw your speech." "I didn't finish what I started," I said. "I want to come back, not because I need the degree to prove anything, but because I want the education I didn't get to finish. On my terms." Another pause. "Then, your seat is still here. It always was." I hung up and looked up at the sky. Gray clouds swirled overhead, but there was a sliver of gold cutting through the edge. That was enough. That night, I walked into our apartment to find Elijah watching my launch speech on YouTube. Volume low, his legs swinging off the side of the couch. "You really said all that?" he asked. I nodded. "And you meant it?" "Every word." He grinned. "I told my teacher my sister made an app that might end up on the president's phone." I laughed, soft, disbelieving. "That's probably the first time someone's gone viral wearing a hoodie and no makeup." He leaned his head against my shoulder, still looked like a boss. I closed my eyes, breathing in the moment. I wasn't here because someone gave me a seat. I was here because I built my own table. And now, everyone wanted to pull up a chair. 1 year to the day after I first translated that contract at Rusty's Diner, I stood on a makeshift stage in a community center in Birmingham, Alabama. The folding chairs were packed wall to wall. Grandmothers in their Sunday best, teenagers in hoodies and earbuds, single moms bouncing toddlers on their hips. The air smelled like paper programs, peppermint, and cheap coffee. And the banner above my head read in bold blue letters, Law Corps, free legal education for everyone. The mayor was there. So was a local pastor. 2 members of Congress sat in the front row, but I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the kids in the back. The ones who looked like Elijah. The ones who reminded me of myself. I took a breath. "You ever been told to sign something you didn't understand?" I asked the crowd. Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone in the back, an older man with a cane, called out, "More times than I can count." I nodded. Me too. I watched my mom sign away a payment plan for her medicine because no one told her what the interest rate meant. I watched my neighbors get evicted, fined, arrested, not because they broke the law, but because they didn't know they had the right to ask questions. I paused, letting that land. So I started asking. And when the answers weren't clear, I built something to make them clearer, for all of us. Scattered applause, honest, quiet, the kind that means someone heard you. After the event, people lined up to talk. One woman asked if Law Corps could help her challenge a predatory rent-to-own agreement. A retired truck driver told me he'd use the app to fight an unfair traffic fine. A teenager showed me the search warrant versus intimidation module on his phone and said, "I finally understand what I'm allowed to say." I stayed until the last question was answered and the last thank you was given. My cheeks hurt from smiling, but something in my chest had settled. I felt rooted, present. Outside, the southern air was thick with humidity and the faint scent of blooming wisteria. Colin was waiting near the car, holding 2 bottles of sweet tea like peace offerings. "You know you just made 3 politicians cry in public, right?" he said. I rolled my eyes. "They'll live." He laughed and handed me a cold bottle. Then he pulled an envelope from his jacket, that familiar sheepish expression tugging at his mouth. "What now?" I asked, already suspicious. "Open it." Inside was a short letter, handwritten in looping, careful script. "Dear Miss Jordan, we are proud to inform you that your re-enrollment at Emory University has been approved with a full scholarship. The Law and Social Change Fellowship will now bear your name. You're not just returning, you're building a legacy." I stared at the page, fingers frozen around it. You did this? I asked. No, he said. You did. I just made a few calls to make sure the world kept up. My throat tightened. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it to my chest. I want to finish it, I said softly. Not for the title, but the journey. Colin smiled. You've already taught more law than most professors ever will, but finish it. That fall, I returned to Emory. No cameras, no press. Just me, a spiral notebook, a battered backpack, and the same hunger I'd carried since I was a teenager, reading contracts behind the counter. I took my seat in the back of the lecture hall. Some students recognized me, some didn't. I didn't care either way. I was here for me now. Around the same time, I launched the Second Glance Foundation, a nonprofit offering legal literacy grants to youth in underserved communities. The slogan was simple: read it again, this time with power. We started small. A dozen pilot grants, community workshops, free legal translators in 5 languages. Then came the congressional hearings. I was invited to speak before a Senate committee on digital access to legal resources. I stood at that podium, this time in heels and a tailored navy blazer, and told the story of a girl who once read legal clauses on her smoke break because she was too stubborn to be left out of the conversation. And I wasn't done. I spoke in juvenile detention centers, in shelters, in after-school programs, not to save anyone, but to stand beside them, to say, I've been in your seat. I know what it feels like to be underestimated, overlooked, written off. And through it all, LawCorps kept growing. It spread from Atlanta to Detroit, from Baltimore to Dallas. By Christmas, we had beta users in 27 states. One night in December, just before the holidays, I went back to Rusty's Diner. The place hadn't changed much. The tiles were still cracked, the coffee still bitter, the neon still flickered like a tired heartbeat. I slid into the same booth from that first night, the one where Colin had slapped that contract in front of me and told me to translate it. He joined me a few minutes later, 2 mugs of black coffee in hand. You ever think it would come to this? He asked. I looked around the diner, the chipped linoleum, the buzzing lights, the waitress behind the counter trying to work 2 tables and the phone at once. I didn't think it would go anywhere, I admitted. He nodded slowly. Funny thing is, neither did I. We sat in silence for a while, comfortable silence, a kind of full-circle silence. Then a new waitress approached our booth. She was young, nervous, dark curls pulled into a puff. She had a notepad in one hand, and when she saw me, her eyes went wide. You're her, she stammered, the app lady. I smiled. I am. My aunt used your app, she said, breathless. She got her job back after being fired unfairly. She said to tell you, thank you. I reached out and gently took her hand. Tell her she did it herself, I said. I just handed her the flashlight. The girl beamed. That's what she said you'd say. As she walked away, Colin lifted his mug. To the ones who never got a second look, he said. I raised mine too. And the ones who made them look again. We clinked our glasses. No cameras, no headlines, just 2 people who knew the revolution wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a quiet return to where it all started. And this time, I didn't look back with regret. I looked forward, because I knew, whatever came next, I was ready. The storm didn't come all at once. It started slow, like sabotage always does. Quiet, polite, almost invisible. A postponed meeting here, a missing file there. Then my calendar invite to the development sprint mysteriously disappeared. Passwords expired, security clearance flagged as pending review. At first I thought it was an IT glitch, a few bugs in the system, but systems don't glitch like that. People do. One morning I showed up early to the Mercer Tech Innovation Lab, badge in hand, only to be told, again, that I wasn't in the system. I stood there, in my own building, with my own team already inside, and watched as a receptionist I'd never seen before offered me a laminated visitor sticker, like I was an intern showing up on the wrong day. I waited another 45 minutes before someone from facilities finally let me in. The meeting had already started. Graham Delaney stood at the front of the whiteboard, dry erase marker in hand, talking about legal exposure and redefining scope. My team, my people, sat silent, eyes flicking from him to me as I entered the room like an uninvited guest at my own birthday party. Tessa, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Glad you could join us. I didn't sit. We were just reevaluating the outreach component of LawCorps, he continued. Our latest legal review suggests the educational scenarios may present reputational risk if interpreted as direct legal guidance. It's not legal advice, I said calmly. It's education. Everything is scenario-based and clearly sourced. Even so, Graham replied, still smiling like a cat behind glass, we're recommending we scale back the public school pilots. Keep it to private beta testing for now. Just to mitigate liability. No, I said, my voice steady. Those pilots are the whole point. You cut the schools, you cut the mission. You don't protect the company, you protect the systems it's supposed to challenge. A few heads turned. Graham uncapped the marker again. Miss Jordan, we appreciate your passion, but some of these decisions require a deeper understanding of institutional boundaries. I know boundaries, I said. I've lived them my whole life. And just like that, the conversation was over. But the war had escalated. That night, I went straight to Colin's office. He was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading through Q4 reports like nothing was on fire. When I walked in, he looked up and saw it in my face before I even spoke. They're trying to kill it, I said. Who? Graham. And whoever's feeding him from the shadows. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his temple. I'll step in. No, I said. Let me. Tessa. I need to earn this. You said that, remember? But I need your backup. I don't need you to fight the war. I just need to know you're standing behind me when I walk in with the truth. His jaw tightened. Then he nodded. You have it. Quiet, strong, and immediate. The next morning, I showed up early. Earlier than anyone. I brought donuts, plain glaze, apple fritters, powdered sugar, and placed them on the table without a word. Then I plugged in my laptop and loaded a presentation. When the team filed in, I didn't wait. I want to show you what LawCorp really is, I said. Not from a liability standpoint, from a human one. I pressed play on the projector. The first clip showed a teenager, same kid from Langston Prep, saying, "This app helped my mom understand her lease. We stopped an eviction. I didn't know apps could do that." Then a janitor talking about how he used the wage theft module to recover his stolen pay. Then a single mother who avoided a payday loan trap because LawCorp broke the fine print down for her on a cracked phone at a bus stop. Each story, each voice. The room went silent. This, I said, turning from the screen, is why I'm not scaling back. You don't build change by playing it safe. You build it by facing the discomfort and walking through it anyway. The door creaked open. Graham entered, stiff and uninvited. He stood at the back of the room with his arms folded across his chest. Tessa, he said. May I say something? No, I replied, turning back toward the team. Not until I'm done. He didn't move. Then Colin walked in, quiet, deliberate. He walked to the front of the room and stood beside me without saying a word. Then he turned to the team. I've seen what she's building, he said, and I've never been more certain of anything. This company was built on risk. If we back down now, we betray every value we pretend to stand for. Graham shifted, but said nothing. After the meeting, the developers came up to me one by one, shaking my hand, clapping my back. One whispered, "My cousin needs this. Let me know how I can help." That night, I walked home with sore feet and a full heart. The city hummed around me, subway rumbles, window light flickers, sirens in the distance, and I knew, without a doubt, that we had survived our first ambush. But it wasn't over. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by legal notes, app mock-ups, community feedback. Elijah sat on the floor beside me, legs folded, headphones in, mumbling his way through geometry. Our mom was already asleep, TV remote slipping from her fingers on the recliner. I was reviewing the final draft of a new clause, one for the open-source licensing of the educational content, when my phone buzzed. A message from Colin. We need to talk. Investor Relations just flagged urgent concerns. Meeting at 8 a.m. The next morning, I stepped into the boardroom and felt it before anyone spoke. Eyes flicked to me, but none met mine. Colin sat, flanked by legal counsel and 2 investor reps. The air felt thin. We're not questioning your intelligence, one of the suits said. Navy pinstripes, Princeton lapel pin. But this is unprecedented. No degree, no formal resume. And now, you're the face of our most visible launch. I leaned forward. Calm. Unshaken. You're not afraid I'll fail, I said. You're afraid I'll succeed outside your blueprint, that I'll show people there's another way in. That's not fair, he stammered. No, I said, it's accurate. Karen Cho, the general counsel, finally spoke. From a legal standpoint, there's no issue. Tessa's title is accurate. Her contributions are documented. She's filed intellectual property under her own name. The backlash is emotional, not structural. Then Colin stood. His voice was low, steady. I hired Tessa because she saw what none of us did. She saved this company from a billion-dollar sinkhole. She turned a back-pocket pitch into the most successful platform we've ever launched. If you force me to choose between her and a few scared donors, I will choose her every time. Silence. After the meeting, he caught up with me in the hallway. You okay? No, I said honestly, but I'm used to that. He nodded. You shouldn't have to be. They don't really see me, I said. Oh, they see you, he replied. That's why they're scared. That night, I returned to the lab. Everyone was gone. The room was dim, but I didn't touch my laptop. I sat at the far window, watching headlights flicker across the parking lot like fireflies. My phone buzzed again. Elijah. Saw the news. Don't let them talk slick. You're the real deal. I smiled. Then I walked to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and wrote 3 words. Launch on time. Because that was the point. We weren't asking permission anymore. We were rewriting the terms. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means you felt something. And I'm truly grateful for your time. Tessa's journey wasn't just about proving her brilliance. It was about reclaiming dignity in a world that often overlooks quiet power. Her story teaches us that credentials may open doors, but courage walks you through them. That the fine print in life, those overlooked moments, dismissed voices, and invisible battles, are often where the truth hides. We all carry something, a story, a skill, a strength waiting to be seen. And sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you, or one moment where you believe in yourself, to change everything. So tell me, where are you watching this from? I'd love to know what corner of the world this story reached. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. We share stories that matter, stories that remind us who we are and who we can still become. The next chapter could be yours. Let's keep walking forward together.